catch that puts us in. Good evening all, this is Rillian. This evening this content will be rebroadcast from my own main channel, Lillian2_MK, to our team main channel, 2_MK, with my full permission. As we go into this Red Bull Battlegrounds weekend here in Boston, we are looking at Ryu's Kata 22, or more accurately, Ryu's Kata, which we call 22 for various reasons. Obviously, as you can see, this will take our Ryu bot with some modifications, but not those that are heavy to put in. And as you can see, it doesn't affect the bot too much in terms of its capability to do most of the things that Ryu bot is for. It does lose some of its primary functionality because it doesn't try to defend itself after throwing Hadoukens anymore. But if you've had a little bit of time with Ryubot yourself, you probably have enough that you don't specifically need it to keep doing that. So obviously I'll be starting with Bison, as Justfine did, showing off the specifics and capabilities of this kata, and the aims that you'll be trying to achieve with it. For now, however, I'm just going to let it run a little bit. For those of you who are familiar with our Ryubot, so that you can see where we are relative to changes it makes to the bot before I begin the explanation, because this is a very specific guidance session. As you know, normally we make sure that the bot inputs are already in the bot, but only when absolutely necessary will I show on stream these inputs being entered, such as for example with Jury Bot, to make sure that it's clear, people can review later and figure out exactly what it is that is potentially different about theirs. This one is one that is fairly important to be able to see all the little things that can be different in your own and quote-unquote go wrong, and one or two things that technically could count as variants if you really wanted them to. As you know, the main purpose of Ryubot is actually to teach you to punish close range regular Hadoukens with your full strength. So while he doesn't really defend himself anymore, if you've had experience with Ryubot, you should still be doing that more or less correctly. And you can usually tell because now instead of blocking, he'll counter hit you if you do it wrong, because he should be trying to move all the time. If you get it right, generally he won't counter hit you, and he will get hit instead. The rest of that stuff is mostly about hitting him when he's in particular spacings, and making sure that he doesn't get too far ahead of you when he's jumping over your head, more or less randomly. Well, the kata itself involves actions 2, 5, and usually action 1. And there's a lot more jumping over your head randomly, so don't expect to see less of that. These inputs are a slightly different version of the thing that is needed overall. So I'll now be shifting to start to input some of the main ones and moving into the main lessons on the kata itself. Now if you're familiar with our Ryubot, you know that action 1 is relatively complicated. It's a matter of hiding a lot of things in his forward medium punch. Well, this isn't much different, because again you can't change the bot too much, but now you're putting less things in. So I'll actually demonstrate this input as I do it, which obviously may take a few tries, but relatively easy, so we might get it done in one shot or one or two. It is simply a forward medium punch to make him do his overhead. It does not need to be first frame, it does not need to be perfect, it just has to do the forward medium punch and not have, like, stand there forever. It's preferable if you let go of the forward, Don't absolutely have to do that either. Kind of helps a little bit. Helps if you hold back, perhaps. But either way, after that you're going into his axe kick, which is back heavy kick for a little bit. You do this toward the end, and then quickly use a medium kick Tatsu. And as soon as the medium kick Tatsu hits, because it should come out but doesn't always, doesn't have to, then you end the recording basically as soon as he goes into the air. Doesn't matter if he makes contact, any of those things. You could just do it as soon as you're sure he did the Tatsu, and most of the time you'll get what you want. The specific thing about this input is that you're trying to wait a little later into the hit of the medium punch, the overhead, to hit the heavy kick and then cancel and end quickly. This can be a little bit difficult, and if it doesn't work that well, the bot isn't really terribly affected, but it does affect something specific that you probably will get to see later. So I'm just going to do it raw. I'm not going to think too hard about it or try to do it correctly, and we'll see what comes out. So there we go. Messy, a lot of extra stuff put in. And we can see enough for a walk back and everything. Not necessarily good or bad if he walks back. It's more so interactive with other moves and how much of that input gets eaten while in other moves. So let's leave the walk back in it for now, rather than trying to fix it immediately, and see what effect that has on it. But as you can see, the bot itself, while it is affected in the fact that it won't jump at you in the same ways, and often tends to be further out, you can still get moments like this where he's jumping over your head and just randomly doing stuff. And you have to still worry about stuff like this. So we're going to record Action 2. The difference in the recording for Action 2 is not actually in the inputs, but rather in when you end the recording and how close you do it. You're trying to do it from not as close because you kind of want it to be a little messy. In this case, we want to do crouch light kick, crouch light punch, crouch medium kick into a Hadouken. And it doesn't specifically matter which Hadouken you actually do here. Since you're used to the other version where he does the heavy punch Hadouken, we can go with that. This specific one doesn't matter as much as the other one to be used, so let's go with that. The key here is to do all those things so that you can see all three moves, and preferably to do it while holding down back. That one's going overboard. But a common problem. And not enough. The reason this becomes an issue is because the game is much more likely to be lenient with your actual inputs, and your execution has to get progressively cleaner as you try to input bots. So when you're trying to do things with no warm-up, weird things happen. Also, since the Hadouken doesn't specifically cancel, you do have to be concerned about it, because part of the reason for doing it this way is actually because it forces you to recognize the latest possible frame you could cancel on that is also the move where the frame where it will come out. This is important for a lot of reasons, but it's relatively hard to get used to. This was actually required for the original as well, and it was the thing that stopped certain parts of the planked Hadouken from coming out. Now the reason that this is harder to do is because in this case you're trying to end the recording about the time when he starts to throw the Hadouken. Normally you can see him charge the key in his hand, and that's your cue to stop. You should actually be pressing before that, which is why you're seeing this effect here. But you're hoping that when you press it, the key is in his hand at that moment. And the focus on ending the recording causes the flip at the end and the glitch where you do the Hadouken itself wrong. That one, for example, is basically too early and it put a light punch in it. Again, because I'm too used to this recording being the other way. That's what you want, though. If you've gotten it right, he can still cancel the crouch medium kick into the Hadouken. Anywhere along that line where you can barely see the key in his hand, or just about to be released actually, is fine. The key being that the regular version of this is ended when he gets back to crouch block. Well, just down back, because you're not usually actually being attacked. But you've managed to wait long enough while holding down back to see it different. In this recording, you're aiming to not do that. The final recording is easier. You can make it tougher on yourself if you really want a challenge, and slightly change the way that the bot functions by throwing out a light Hadouken. In this case, it does need to be light. You can experiment with other ones, but so far we found that everything else is a problem slightly sooner or later because of how Shoryukens are seen by the game's inputs. You're doing a light Hadouken. You can blink into throw, not absolutely necessary, but it can make the input a little bit harder for both doing and for dealing with the bot. Or you can tap throw right afterward while he's throwing the Hadouken, and then you just hold up forward. The reason that the throw is helpful is because it makes you focus on something between the Hadouken ending and the up forward part. Your aim, however, is that once he's in the air, as soon as you see him leave the ground, do another Hadouken motion if you want to challenge yourself, or just wait until he gets into the air properly, before he starts to come down, and you end the recording there. So you can end it. That would be a little bit too early, probably. That's probably correct. And if you want to go for the hard version, you add it in like that. Putting the throw in after the jump is acceptable in this case, but you'll see some changes in behavior later. It's really just about whether or not you put in your jumps by starting closer to forward, again on pad, or closer to up, and it can change the bot very little. You generally won't see neutral jumps unless you spent far too much in the directly up position. You can get a lot more out of it by mentally forcing yourself to do it forward instead. So let's turn off actions 3 and 4, and actually action 1 as well. In this case, just to show off what it is that he's supposed to be doing overall for the Kata. In this case, he should have 2 Hadoukens he can throw, and apparently a punch. You can see the Shoryuken come out. And you can see something else too. He's able to throw that Hadouken as well as this one. I'm not sure he's actually throwing the fast one, really. I'm gonna have to fix it. But that also points out part of the reason why it's important. If you get it correct in terms of the throwing of the faster Hadouken, there's a timing and spacing at which he can throw them like that. It might even be that there's an edge shift involved here that works, but I'm not absolutely sure. The key is not the precise input, but simply to make it so that if he goes from action 2 into action 2, he can throw a Hadouken and not jump. But to create the situation where if he goes from 2 into 5, he can jump, even though it looks like the same Hadouken. You're not really aiming to tell these Hadoukens apart if you have the skill to determine which one is which. That might even help you later on, so it's not really relevant. At the highest level, you turn off the inputs for this kata, so you can't see the action number to know which one happened. I'm going to clean that up because, again, I got down forward, which is causing some issues. As you can see, Street Fighter is very lenient, but I wouldn't suggest that someone who is unfamiliar or just trying to get some practice in actually put in the effort to put it in that cleanly. It's not really worth it in this case for you. So that's what you'd want, and then you just want the Hadouken to come out. Let's try running it and see if it does. It usually doesn't. In this case, we're looking for action 2 doing the Hadouken by itself. And going back into action 2. So you could actually just turn off action 5 and see what happens. A little quick here, so it doesn't actually work. This is actually the original timing, where you only want it to cancel if he clips. And then he would throw another Hadouken after that. So if you're not really interested so much in the kata, but want to figure out why your Ryubot isn't working, this is also useful information. That speed is the speed at which you can cancel the Hadouken, but it won't come out in neutral. Ryubot original form was basically based on doing that timing and then hitting light and heavy punch again immediately, which, if you get it on the right frames, will cause him to throw an EX Hadouken despite the fact you only did the motion once because the first one wasn't cancelable. But since that's not what we're going for here, I literally have muscle memory for a kata, for a action input, I see. That's not what we're going for, so we're going to go with it a little bit slower, and this is the hard part to get done. You can, in fact, mash the heavy punch to make this work, though. The problem with mashing the heavy punch is probably something I might be able to demonstrate fairly easily now. One, it makes you more likely to do something wrong in terms of spacing, timing, hitting more buttons than you should, any number of things. The second is that it introduces more inputs than you want. And in my case, it doesn't seem to solve the problem of me hitting too many. See? I got like a medium kick in there somehow. But I've never promised for bot inputs to be that easy, unfortunately. So that looks cleaner, but we may see nothing in particular come out of it. Now you'll note that, of course, because it's faster, you will note a lot more of action 2 happening in its entirety rather than action 2 repeating itself. But this is usually a rhythm thing. If he gives me the chance, I'll poke him and show you. So we'll turn back on 5 to see what happens here. So you'll throw, continue to do clip stuff, jump again. This is acceptable, that Shinkun, that's why he doesn't have his meter on usually. But yes, this input can be too perfect, such that he'll just keep on throwing the fireball. You can decide whether or not you find that interesting, or not, depending on your character. There's no specific use in the bot doing it such that he only ever does the fireball, but there isn't really much usefulness in him doing the full thing either. You can actually tweak this relative to your own character just by looking at whether or not you're affected in particular ways by zoning. And as a result of that, I'll go into showing you how this is supposed to work. And if needed, I'll change some more inputs along the way when it's clear why certain things happen. So let's start with the very basics here. Ryu throws some buttons out, and your job is to hit medium kick. If he does the chain correctly, with a very precise timing in the game's flow, you can't actually hit him with his medium kick. And most people's medium kicks don't hit him, because he'll push himself out, and that's very important to understand about Ryu. If he does a close range chain like that, he does in fact have the capacity to create enough pushback to not get hit by that Hadouken. If he doesn't do a full chain, or if you get sometimes hit by one part and manage to block the others, you can hit him. Even if he would have jumped right after, even if the Hadouken is the one from 5 and not from 2, he can jump. You can clip him. It depends on the spacing. And because pre-jump frames are basically 3 frames, there are very few characters whose medium kick reaches but won't hit him in time. You just have to know exactly when to hit it. But the important thing about this kata is to note that when you can hit him, when he's done a set of buttons that allows you to hit him, and when you can't hit him, and the very small gray area between, the reason you're hitting the medium kick is so that if he does jump, but he was too far out, your medium kick can usually recover in time for you to just block. Now, the other thing is that purposely, with the general timing of this, he won't actually throw out a button in the air. He will empty jump it. Which is fine, because then it makes you have to defend yourself properly from closer. He might throw you, he might do a low. There's a lot of advanced specifics to this because of the fact that he can do those things. So for now I'm going to change this. As with most katas, you don't really need to have your life at falling. I'm going to change it to auto recover and move on from there. So your goal here is see that, clip him if you realize he's close enough to be clipped, and start to learn to recognize the space at which he is going to be clipped by your medium kick. Obviously this depends by character. Some can't hit him at all because they don't have the correct medium kick, but they do have some other button that will hit high on his way in but still be quick enough to cause him problems. So that's the main point of the kata. First of all, he's gonna jump sometimes, and it's your job to either get out of the way or be ready to block. Now, because Ryu has a lot of options and not all of us can be sure we should anti-air, we actually end up most of the time poking the button anyway, like that. And then trying to figure out what to do. If you try to immediately hit another button, this sort of thing happens to you. If you hit the wrong thing, if you flinch in that very short space of time that you have between recognizing that he jumped and response to that jump, all sorts of bad things can happen to you. Normally you just hold down back and then hold back when he jumps, or you don't hold down back at all and you just walk away. But obviously the aim is to be so ready that you can respond even to that. However, if you try to respond to that immediately with your anti-air, depending on the speed of your character's anti-air and how the specifics of the hitbox of the anti-air, how it reaches for you, you may not be able to get anything good. You may not even succeed at the anti-air at all. Now, obviously, we all know that jabs can do this. But Ryu has a couple of good jump-ins that deal with that, and while we won't go into detail in a bunch of them now, I'll turn on action 1 so you can see certain things start to happen. Adding action 1 causes a different change altogether. He starts to use the movement, he starts to use Tatsu to move over your head, and the rhythm of the bot changes somewhat. As you can see, by putting the other in, you get the medium punch Shoryuken. That thing I mentioned at the end of 5, you can get that in there if you need it for some reason. This can be for people who realize that their tendency is to jump back after he's jumped in on them with it. It gives him an option for clipping you out of the air with that. Kind of a problem when you're not used to certain things. So if you're the sort of person who recognizes your panic is to jump backward, you've gotten as far into the kata as you needed to. He threw it, you clipped him, and then he jumped. And your response is to jump backward. Put a little effort into putting that last Hadouken in on action 5. Because he might clip you on the way out, depending on your timing for the back jump. Whereas none of his other buttons are likely to do this. But obviously you can see he spends a lot more time in action 1 mode doing other random stuff. And the main problem with that, for you as a player, not for the bot, is that he keeps on switching sides and making you change your focus all the time. This is intentional, of course. But it is relatively a step up depending on what you think you're supposed to be doing. So you clip him, he jumps over your head and throws you. You're like, okay, that was technically bad, but eventually it will wear you down. If you kept your life in the falling state, it would wear you down both in terms of health and mentally. So you could see that right there. If I decided to jump back instead, I might have gotten clipped by that. And I can't jump back too early because my own pre-jump might get caught, depending on how my reactions are. So mostly this part is just wearing you down, chipping you, making you mentally focused on something else. The something else doesn't specifically matter, but we found that the repositioning that comes from those, because he tends to go over your head and you tend to be holding down bat for various reasons, namely to avoid that low. So you can see there, if I had jumped later in that, I would probably get clipped. Or this could happen. This is because jump back is not really something you want to do a lot. Now, in certain flows he does get jump in buttons. And you can fix 5 so that he generally has jump in buttons if you prefer it. But it doesn't really matter so much for those who are focused on how this is supposed to be working, whether or not he has those. But now that I've demonstrated what you can make him do by putting the effort into putting that there, I'm going to fix action 5. To be the much simpler version, where I end the recording a little bit earlier so that he can get his air buttons, and he's not going to do various Shoryukens that he could otherwise do. Depending on when you hit the jump itself, relative to hitting after the throw, he'll need a different ending animation when you hit the recording end button. So you're going to have to experiment with that yourself. But as you can see, it really doesn't matter whether or not he has the jump buttons or not. It does help here a little bit, because the better you get it, the more likely he is to do, like, jump over, like, kick into clippy stuff on the ground. So if you want to practice your cross-up defense and continue practicing your cross-up defense, particularly if you want to keep Ryubot in his full form, you might care a little bit about it. So yeah, tweak that according to your needs until he actually does something in the air that either you're afraid of or just makes your life a little bit more difficult. What often happens though is that he does this more so in response to you doing things correctly. And you can set up stuff with that too. You can set up stuff that's based on him getting clipped, because he'll usually jump afterwards for various reasons. He has the light Hadouken because the Shoryuken comes out of Action 5 regardless of what you do, more or less. There's a weird interaction between the leniency of the inputs and of course the fact that you've ended Action 2 with a Hadouken, started 5 with a different one. Depending on your timing, this will result in me either having Shinku Hadouken or not, which is really not that relevant. But more importantly, him being able to just light Shoryuken randomly. So many, sort of in neutral really. Which is something that you can continue to learn to punish. This is a thing that Ryubot is for. So that you can recognize that a light Shoryuken has happened and respond to it even though it's a relatively quickly recovering move compared to most people's crush counter buttons. And since we're usually in defense mode at that time, it doesn't feel quite the same. But you know, you still need to be able to do that, and it helps if you can. Depending on your timing for how you started certain things, he will do the overhead more often when you clip him. Or he'll just do it randomly in neutral by himself. This is also important because, especially if he's blocking certain things, or you're repositioning yourself, or if you happen to get hit by anything he's doing here, the overhead can just come out, and it will force you to stop crouch blocking. But this doesn't happen for everyone. It has more to do with when you started to press the button. You have a lot of space in terms of at the beginning of Action 1 that gets eaten in other inputs. So you can use up a lot of that space, and you can tweak how often he actually does the overhead as a result of that. So let's do that a little bit. I want to walk forward a little bit more before I do the overhead. And then more or less proceed as normal. Although this time I think I'm going to try to not walk backward before the axe kick. I have faith in that for now. Let's see what happens. Okay, that cancel's still happening. So when he's in the air, he still doesn't seem to get time to put out the medium punch, which is fine because the further into Action 1 you move the medium punch, the less likely he is to do it in the air. Or sure, now you don't want to do Action 1. But as you can see, for the most part, he doesn't really do the overhead still. You still have to poke him or make him miserable in some way. But if you're interacting with him correctly, at some point he's going to do that instead of jumping. Especially if you do stuff to either interrupt or bother him while he's doing Tatsu. As you can see, I keep on crouching under Tatsu because I play Bison and Chun-Li. Down back is my default. But I don't have to. I can walk away from him. And when you walk away from him and get hit by Tatsu standing, it changes his rhythm at least a little bit. But none of that is the important part of the bot. None of that is the important part of the kata. I'm just showing you what can happen, and mostly telling you that it isn't important and therefore you shouldn't care too much about how it turns out precisely. You can fiddle with it to your preference. The important thing is this part. Make sure that when you have done things correctly, he is at a particular range, you hit the button, and you're still prepared to do anything else afterwards. But let's go a little bit more into the specifics of when the Hadouken was ended and what that causes to get eaten and doesn't not get eaten. Because as I noted, he does have specific frames where you can do the Hadouken and the ending is different. So here's one variation that can be very important to people who are antsy about getting hit as a general thing. Rather than waiting for the Hadouken to reach his hands, you actually do the cancel. You can do it from close, or you can do it from further away and not have it come out. There are multiple ways to do this, but for now let's go with the close range version because it's easier to understand. You're still aiming for that combo to happen. And in this case, I'm ending too early because you're not supposed to. You're looking for that sort of timing, where the Hadouken has hit and is dissipating. And again, the frames are going to matter. Sadly, we have no way to offer you perfect frame bots. But let's show what happens here. What will start to happen is that after he's thrown out the Hadouken, especially in Action 2, if he immediately starts to do something else, you can see that at least one of the later actions starts to come out, probably around frame 13, 14, something like that. So now you can see that he starts to actually do the axe kick, and he can also do probably the light punch. It's usually the light punch. And the throw. If you missed him, he will do something that you have to try to respond to. Otherwise, if he was too close, he'll get counter hit. A lot of this depends on both your timing and the ending of that move. But at least for really bad spacings, and if you've done it with a particular timing, in this case it hasn't worked because, actually I don't know. What normally happens is that he will immediately do crouching light punch or axe kick. And one of those will clip your extended button because you were too far out when you began what you were doing. This is, however, not particularly useful in terms of the bot. It's not something you need to understand, per se. But that is what I'm referring to. If you get it right, you'll recognize, okay, he can actually hurt me if I stick out the wrong thing here. If you're that sort of person, you can take out the throw, for example. Because all the throw is doing is eating input so he doesn't move and stays on the ground even though you missed. And there's the light punch. This sort of thing happens more so when you've missed altogether. And it particularly happens when your timing on when you hit the medium kick was bad. If you were late, he'll do stuff like that and clip you with the button. It also has to do with both the Hadouken he uses and how far away he is when he does it. This is actually an integral part of high-level Ryu play, because Ryu can lure people into responding to Hadoukens that they shouldn't respond to and then clip them with axe kick. Granted, if you know that he's going to do the axe kick, you get a lot off of it. But you know, just being twitchy and trying to stick out buttons to keep Ryu quiet, you can get yourself into a lot of trouble that way. So we decided to include that in the bot as well. So just noting that if you prefer that he jumps after you miss in 5 instead of doing what he just did, sticking out his foot for no reason, you can test with your character to figure out What is it that I want Ryu to do here based on whatever my response is? So with that set up right now, I'm going to switch it because I actually do train with this version. So let's go to character select. So while doing that with Bison is fun, and there's a lot of Bison stuff I should be showing off, I'll get back to Bison. I'm actually going to go to a character who has less specific things to do about it. And change stage for Chase Base. So, Chun-Li's standing medium kick is slower than Bison's, but still enough to stop this. In order for Ryu to escape from you entirely, your stand medium kick has to be probably 10 frames. Or just not reach, obviously. In fact, Chun-Li is much better equipped for this as a general thing because her standing medium kick reaches further. But she also has a different hitbox on it, so she's slightly more likely to get clipped when he does stuff at the range where it's correct, and slightly more likely to be jumped over. She just gets more off of certain things. But as you can see, he does tend to get flicked back by it. And you can practice stuff like pressing the medium kick and immediately going back to back down charge and all sorts of things. But if you're too far out, misspace it, misunderstand what's going on, any number of those things, and the problem becomes your problem instead of Ryu's problem. So in my case here, I am trying to hit the button and go back to down back charge, and then do a bunch of stuff with confirming the button and a whole lot of other things. Of course, with Chun-Li, it's not really so required because you can just do that, and that is a punish, which is what you learn from Ryubot. But what if you don't have meter? What if you don't want to do that? What if you don't have the confidence that you can pull that off in that timing? Or any number of things where it's just not a good idea right then. What else is it that you can use? So obviously I came to Chun-Li to make it quicker since I don't have a lot that I need to do with her. You can do a lot of muscle memory stuff. I'll note that the general reason why the heavy punch Hadouken is used in 5 is that if you get that right, and you happen to be holding forward at the time, when the Hadouken is still on screen, if you happen to neutral jump it for some reason, he will reposition himself by doing Solar Plexus Strike most of the time. So that's something to keep in mind in case you want to change the Hadouken. He'll end up doing more overheads if you neutral jump, which doesn't really help too much. So here I'll corner myself to show off one more thing, and he will clearly defy me by coming back out of the corner. But if your character uses air-to-air, for example, in this same situation, you have to be careful because his other reactions don't always result in that turning out well for you. There are a lot of things you can learn from this particular kata about your character specifically. When to not hit the button at all, for example. There I shouldn't have hit it, because he was too far out. There was no way that was going to work. That one was ambiguous. So you can definitely still get hit. In my case, this is basically to make me learn the range at which I should or should not hit it, entirely based on risk-reward situations. Over time, my mind will eventually figure out, okay, this is not the range to hit this at, and if I do it too often, I'm going to get hurt. As you can see, the Tatsu timing also causes him to be more likely to just do the medium kick without anything else happening. But I assure you, you can always counter hit that. If you have failed to counter hit that and Ryu has hit you, it's either because your move whiffed altogether, like that, or you were too slow. And the thing is, you don't have to be too slow by much. You can be too slow by very little and still get yourself in some form of trouble. Now the thing is, can you do the air to air as well? And this is also a good thing to learn. If I do hit him, if I do whiff all together and he jumps immediately, and again, for this I might need to take out the throw. In fact, let's do that. I'm showing off what is necessary for a character where your better option is to air them and your anti-air isn't that good or doesn't cover a lot of ground or you don't get a lot off of it. If your character is like that, it's better to not have the throw in here at all. It makes it a little harder because you don't think of a different thing to hit. You could try putting the axe kick there, or just a crouching light punch there. Depending on how you want to do the inputs, you can get some other stuff. So in Chun-Li's case, let's put in nothing because what I want is for him to jump immediately. If you put in a different button because you want to increase the number of times he whiff punishes you, that's also alright. But right now my goal is making sure that he jumps right after the Hadouken because I have the sort of character where that could mess me up. Now, if I do this based on the other timing, you just have to know that he has to hold the button a certain amount of time. Because all you care about is that he's holding up when the Hadouken ends. It doesn't specifically matter if the Hadouken came out from 2 or 5. You can mess up his jump timing, but most of the time, since up forward is just up forward, you don't care. So I hold it a little later. And I wait for a flip. Maybe it's too late. I'll fix it if so. Well, let's see what we get. Looks like we have a delay for some reason, so let's try doing that faster. This is usually because, as I noted, the Hadouken timing isn't really quite the same between the one that comes out at the end of 2, the one that gets eaten by certain things. A lot of stuff happens because what you want is for the 2 Hadouken and the 5 Hadouken to have the potential to act the same, relatively speaking, so that he jumps often. I could leave it like that and he'd probably still jump. He doesn't actually need to leave the ground usually for this to work. But if you want more overheads, then you can do it that way. This is my preferred version of it because he'll stay on the ground longer sometimes and then do more of these, which is close to perfect. So that's another option you have. You can just push yourself harder by making it so he doesn't really jump at all. You never record Action 5 as if he could jump, and then weird stuff starts to happen in neutral. And you have to worry about a lot more of those. So once again, by character. But what we're looking for here is a situation where he's more likely to jump out of 5, and I need to care. Also, because of the way Hadoukens interact, you get a lot more stuff like that happening. But I'm looking for that moment where I stick out the button, I whiff, but he's jumped. And I've reduced the chances of that happening, but there's one. The reason is this is to force your mind to focus on ground game and mentally fatigue you. And the Tatsu will make you change your block direction and all that stuff. It's basically drills. Most katas tend to be. So it's entirely intentional that with certain times he will just keep on tatsuing over your head, and you have to basically put up with that. The difference is purely in what he does when he comes out of the tatsu. His rhythm is changed by which inputs you choose to use. But that's the hard part. That's the key part. You have to either be ready to dash or be ready to air. In those moments where he has happened to clip you from close, throw out the Hadouken, and you hit the button thinking you were close enough, and I went, oh no, I'm not. Usually this is after a crouch medium kick into Hadouken like that. But as you can see, there's a lot of spacing stuff that you can learn from just doing this over and over. And it's best for you to try to find which of the variations, all of them will of course be listed in the Kata 22. They're not going to be specific variations in the strict sense, they're more so, this is the way you cause him to do this particular thing, and try it out and see what you get. More so goals of the bot itself, and you should figure out what buttons and so on give you that. But in this case, as I said, I've made it actually rare that he jumps, which is intentional because I want to spend the maximum amount of time doing grounded defense, forcing myself to focus on that. Thinking about stand blocking, ground blocking, distance. I want to be distracted from the spacing as much as possible to force myself to learn to do it properly. You also have the fake Tatsu cross-up, which is semi-popular. Which also works if you're very defensive at particular timings. You can combine this with bulldogging the same way you tend to do for Galbot to make yourself really miserable. But there's the first success of that entire time at what I was thinking about, or trying to do. To press medium kick, clip, fail, recognize the jump, jump air to air, and still have everything happen. If you've ever wondered why it is hard for professionals to anti-air things, do this for a while and maybe you'll understand a little bit better at least. It is possible to have all of your focus taken up with just doing this thing or that thing. Especially since, in this case, he doesn't really have to do a jump after the Hadouken. He just tends to in this particular version. And that's why I want him to do that as little as possible, so that I think more about how it should work. But I don't really have to, because if I'm at the right spacing, he will get hit, and if I'm at the wrong spacing, he will counter hit me. But then I do have those spacings where I am ready and end up getting the counter hit myself, because I am in a perfect position for that. And then I have to learn a bunch of stuff to do off of counter hit medium kick. But what do you do if your character doesn't work like this at all? Based on that, I'll now shift into Colleen. Because Colleen's medium kick is not really for this purpose. Fortunately, many characters who are like this have a different way around the problem, because it's just that their standing medium kick isn't the long range best one. Generally, you don't care which button it actually is, you only care how safe the button is to hit, because your opponent can always block. And that's your goal, to find the button that you are at max range, they can't do more. It doesn't really matter if you're minus anymore because you're back at neutral in almost all situations. You just want them to not be able to punish it. Bonus if it somehow retracts its hurt box really fast. But as you can see, it's very unlikely that even if he is fairly close, that Colleen is going to make that work. In fact, given what the aim is, namely to stop him from jumping, she has no option of using that button. And as you can see, her medium punch isn't that much better. It's a great move in itself for many things, footsies, pressure, but not that job. However, here's an option I have, apparently. So let's see how many times I can get away with that at that range. And still block, because that's the important part. I was holding down bat, so that was terrible. But you still need to be able to check it. In fact, Colleen's standing heavy punch is one of the faster buttons because it's not very good distance. It reaches not as far as medium kicks, but it's good enough that I can probably make use of it. But it doesn't seem to catch him when he's jumped most of the time, it just lets me block anyway. And since Ryu does tend to neutral jump, you can't go just, oh, I'll use Colleen's counter, because he might never actually do that. On the other hand, that move is actually 7 frames. No, wait a minute. No, it's 7 frames to catch back, but when you're actually doing certain things in it, the way that the boxes work, you can get away with some stuff like that. So in this case, I'm thinking about the entire thing differently. Because right now, if my opponent jumps against Colleen, depending on what button they hit or think I will hit, I can create a mind game. They can't hit more buttons. And if they were at maximum range for this anyway, technically I'm fine. Ryu's not actually one of the better characters to do this on because he can get away with a lot of stuff. Also, please note that since that is only -6, the other problem with moves that hit on the 9th frame is functionally that Ryu could just Shoryuken or jab and trade with them. With medium buttons, this is not a problem because he won't actually trade, but he can Shoryuken. I'll leave that as an exercise to the viewer in how they want to play that mind game. But for now, let's focus on not hitting her V skill, but rather just clipping with, like, crouch medium kick in this case. As you can see, that actually hits from fairly far out. The question then is, does it recover fast enough that I can actually hit him while he's doing something? Well, I had time to get counter hit for randomly hitting a different button, so I probably had time to block. In fact, it's technically easy to do. I probably even have time to counter. And he's gone into this mode. So as you can see, I do have time to do that. But again, I'm not really suggesting you do it because of neutral jump issues. She does have the capacity to deal with the empty jump as well. But this is much harder because most of us are used to doing our air throws a particular way. So yet more to learn. Note that she does not specifically get away from being hit by other stuff. It's just because the move is slightly different in terms of its hit and hurt boxes compared to what we've been using before. But she can absolutely get hit by that, as you can see. It's just that she's less likely to get hit with it from really far away. If she misses really far, then Ryu will also sometimes miss. Of course, the question is, why are you letting yourself do that move if you expect it to miss from really far? Of course, if your crouch medium is long like Colleen's, your option is better because your opponent can't walk back away from you either. Main reason for using stand medium when you otherwise would not is because the range on many people's stand mediums is slightly longer than it is on their crouching ones. Once again, judge by your character specifically. For characters with air throws or specific forms of air-to-airs, you may need to figure out which one to use based on when he jumps even. How far away was he when he jumped? For example, with Colleen, when he's really far out and you realize I have whiffed by a mile, there is no way that was ever going to hit him, then you have to do the forward air throw. If you think I could have been whiff punished there, then you need to do neutral air throw. And if he's basically right on top of your head and you aren't even sure if you have time, you should probably do back jump air throw. Depending on which button your opponent hits, this may mess you up, but they normally need to hit the button early enough that you could have counted them and you could get like the entire idea of how this works. But as you see there, a back jump air throw will take him out at that space, but a forward jump one wouldn't have. Usually, at least. And that one was the neutral jump spacing because I actually got myself out of the way and therefore got hurt. And that one was again the back jump spacing. There is a spacing where Ryu always wins as well on top of all that. So you have to decide really, is this worth it my time? If the person hits a lot of buttons, then you don't really have to worry about it. Just counter. You have time. If they don't hit a lot of buttons, you really should think about it a lot. But you can whiff the air throw based on their spacing as well, and therefore it's important. But as I said, Colleen doesn't have a whole lot to show, just the concepts of stuff that are different. And there's our light punch Shoryu to show off that she can in fact get hit by that. Depending on your skill with your character and your understanding, you can grind at this sort of thing for hours. Don't give yourself carpal tunnel. And end up learning a lot of spacings that don't apply to just Ryu. They apply to Nash, to some extent to Dalsim in a very specific way, to Ken, somewhat to Akuma, almost certainly to Guile, but Guile doesn't tend to jump. But certain Guiles do, so you have to be careful with them too. The key is to understand where you are on the food chain. The reason that Akuma and others matter less is because Ryu is the one where you have to deal with the fireball being a particular amount of negative and others don't. Colleen has neutral jump tricks to go with this too. But not always. But as I have no intention of this stream turning into me showing people how to do various things with Colleen, let's move on. So for all us young Zaku players and all us older Zaku players, and you can take that to mean either interpretation. Now, I've never tried this with Zaku at all. So far, I haven't really labbed Zaku or done other things, but I know what I'm supposed to do. And I know, based on the information I have so far about Zaku's normals, what I'm probably trying to hit and do. So, with no previous interaction between this particular form and Zaku, I'm going to start sticking out buttons and coming up with ideas and show you why this can be used for you. Well, we can see that his crouch medium kick is not really going to help a lot. In fact, that was terrible. The counter hit one works well, but that button does not get me anywhere near where I would figure I should be when it comes to dealing with the Hadouken. Sure, the others probably could have missed because I'm doing this at bad spacings too, but I would figure I would get somewhere with that one, and I don't. So, okay, fine. Crouch medium kick is not that great. Let's not do that. Crouch medium punch might be good though. That is a fairly long normal, so let's go with that. And this is easy to do on any character because all you're doing is basically defense stuff over and over again. Is this button as long as it looks? Not very. Also, again, things that tend to hit low give you the problem where Ryu has the slightly higher chance of getting out of the way of the button. So it's still useful to be able to do this, especially since this is a 6-frame move and I'm pretty sure if he hits the Hadouken from really close I can actually punish him. But most of the time, if he jumps, he's going to get away. If he walks backward a little bit, he's going to get away. All those things become a problem. So I'm not having a lot of faith in this button either. It might be my timing, but right now, not feeling it. So at least let's look for some better options before we go thinking, yeah, this'll work. But he seems to have a similar type of medium kick as Colleen, so we shouldn't be expecting a whole lot here. If you can't do it when Ryu has basically done crouch medium kick at near max range and clip him, it's probably not good. Because good Ryu players know how to space themselves to clip you with that, and that wasn't even that far out. You can actually do it as a pure litmus test in that if he hits you with the light kick, then the medium kick, he pushes himself out to a range where if your button is not hitting, you probably shouldn't be relying on it. Because the light punch can whiff at a particular spacing. And if you realize that the light punch whiffed or didn't come out, and your medium kick is still not working, probably should not use that button either. But you can also tell based on stuff like that, he goes over your head, no, this isn't working. That was a little bit further out. So Zaku doesn't seem to have that sort of normal going on. At least not from those. Medium punch, purely not in this form. Heavy punch, that takes forever. And the problem with taking forever stuff is that if you miss, he will absolutely hit you when he jumps over your head if you missed the spacing. And that's a big concern. You need this move to generally be 22 to 24 frames, which is actually part of why the Kata is called that. But it's actually looking like you still have a time to block, yes, so let's go with that actually. Crush counters are good. I believe that button is safe-ish. And it doesn't seem to take that long to come out. You can do frame data to figure this out, but it doesn't necessarily... you don't necessarily need it. But now I've remembered that Zeku's crouching heavy punch is awesome. As a former Guy player, I'm familiar with the awesomeness of the crouching Bushin elbow. But it seems to be slow. In fact, it's so slow that I think he gets punished for starting a move, which is probably also a bad sign. Now, once you've learned the reach, you can recognize when things go wrong, but furthermore, doing crouching moves gives you the tendency to hold it down back, and you have to train harder to make sure you've done the correct thing in terms of the defense of the jump in. Which is then taking up more of your focus, and then you'll end up getting empty jumped on and thrown, and a bunch of other things. Grinding this for an hour can be taxing, definitely. If you're familiar with your character, it tends to be a little easier. But we see Ryu seems to have more options here than he does most characters. And even if it wasn't that he could jump, this button recovers slowly enough that he might be in trouble. He might be able to get some good stuff on you anyway, just by the fact that you stuck out a button which doesn't retract for a very long time. At least with the others, you have a decent chance of him whiffing something, whereas here it looks more like you have a chance of getting hit. But you can definitely still block in time if he's not really trying too hard. While the 22 frame is optimal, the reason why it's not acceptable to go too high beyond that is because Ken and Akuma have ways of coming down out of the air faster, or making attacks that are more likely to clip you, or just change the situation. So while it would be useful against Ryu alone, and you could totally learn those, please remember to keep in mind to check the frame data of the button. You're looking for total frames, because what you care about is what happens when the move whiffs. And of course, as mentioned before, you should generally not use any move that is faster than Ryu, slower than Ryu hitting a button. So if you use a heavy one, please make sure it is at least, let's see, for Ryu it probably needs to be 11 frames at the latest, because you can't afford to trade with his medium punch, or be beaten by it, relatively speaking. In case of the heavy buttons, I don't think anyone really has any 11 frame normals that in the medium category that you need to care about, but it's all a lesson in how much attention you pay to your frame data, and this is one of the times where frame data is important and you should pay specific attention to it. Hitbox data is secondary in this case, but also still possibly important. But let's change form. That looks better. That looks like I might get something here. Not there, for sure, but it's similar to Colleen in that it doesn't tend to cause me a big problem. But no, I'm having less faith in it now, but not a ton less. It's not Colleen good, but it certainly seems as if you could get something out of it. The problem is that I'm fairly sure that leads into nothing. And whereas Colleen's leading into nothing is fine, because of her playstyle, Zeku's leading into nothing means that Ryu doesn't really have a reason to stop. So the question becomes, what is this form of Zeku's good anti-air anyway? It's not that, probably not. Probably not that. It might have to be a jab again. So let's go for the stand medium kick, which we all know from lots of online happiness that Zeku's stand medium kick is actually fairly decent. So let's default to that. Well, when he's quite close it seems to work. But then I have the question, did I mistime that? Because I did get Shoryuken. Note that you should not be able to get Shoryuken on the light Shoryuken if you hit an 8-frame move. If you do get Shoryuken, it's probably because you were a little too slow. He's only doing -6 Hadoukens ever. If you've timed it quite right, you can't be hit by a 3-frame move. I'm not feeling super comfortable about this range, and he does seem to get over more than I would think he does. But it could be focus fatigue, it could be any number of things, because as I said, I purposely did this straight out of the gate, no idea whatsoever how Ryu Kata 22 interacts with Zeku, so this is the demonstration of how much of this you have to do in order to actually understand what's going on. But I definitely have enough time to block. It just doesn't look like it's going to clip a lot of his extra stuff that he can do. If you're familiar with it, you can definitely see at least a little bit of difference in terms of where Chun-Li can get away with hitting medium kick, which is closer to that range, and where Zeku's blatantly whiffs. Just from my personal muscle memory, I'm expecting that if I hit medium kick at approximately, let's see if I can find one. I expect if I hit medium kick at that range, that I have to wonder whether or not I hit. With Zeku, there's no wondering at all. I know I've missed because his button doesn't reach that far. However, that one impressed me a little bit. So it's a little bit longer than it looks when he does whiff, but there's still definitely enough of a difference for me to be concerned. The other thing you can put in here, which does practically nothing for you in most cases, but could help if you're the sort of person who twitches when people dash at you, is to change it such that action 5 is a dash after the Hadouken before he jumps. This is relatively difficult to input, but it will give you that moment where instead of throwing or instead of jumping, he'll just dash at you. And because the dashing at you part, he's -6, your button is already out, he should dash right into your button. But this is more for when he's outside of your range, because if you were spaced properly, it was going to work either way. When he's outside of your range and manages to dash in at just the right timing, your button, depending on how many active frames it has, will basically let him reach you. Depending on the recovery frames, he may be able to actually get something there, even if it's just a throw. So if you're the sort of person who has stress about that, you can try tapping in the throw at that point. I'm not specifically going to try to do that in this stream. I'm going to go back to Bison and I'm going to demonstrate the main reasons why the final parts of the kata are important and which characters they help with. Chun-Li's dash is fast. She gives up a lot of her options for counter-attacking, but she gets a lot of positioning. Colleen's is not, but Colleen can just use her own V skill to get under it. Zeku has 1 or 2 responses he can use, as well as having an air throw. As you can guess, I like air throw characters. But let's look at Bison's options in a different light. Bison has a slow dash. But Bison's dash has invincibility on a certain frame. It's actually fairly late. It's frame 8 if you're not in V trigger. But functionally, you still get something out of it. And this is a good way of training because you realize how troubled you can become when the thing you want to hit in response is actually hard to do. This is a generally good way to recognize how hard it is for you to actually do a Shoryuken on reaction to a jump in after trying to do something where the opponent was not necessarily going to leave the ground. So you hit the medium kick to keep them quiet because you don't know if they're going to leave the ground or not. And then you still have to be ready to Shoryuken. And if you're the mashy sort of person, as I'm demonstrating now, normally I only hit the button once and I'm learning to hit the button exactly the amount of times that's required. But if you're the type that mashes buttons after block to get what you want, this will also teach you a lot of things about that. Because as soon as you start tapping the button to get that, your focus diminishes in certain ways. You can hit it too early because you're in block stun from one thing and it's not really a true block string. But you can also find that unfortunate spot in the game where the input buffer is not saving you. You are mashing too fast and now you end up not hitting on the reversal timing you needed because you were hitting the button some other time. So it's actually relatively hard for me to mash because I've done this so much, but as you can see, you can mistime it because you're mashing. That one was because of range, I'll note, but you can definitely mistime by mashing. Ryu won't generally punish you for this, but he can, and it becomes an issue. The bigger issue is that when you mash, you spend a little bit longer doing the mashing and a little less time actually fixing the problem. Those few frames make a difference in terms of whether or not you're ready to anti-air or not, especially if your anti-air is slow or difficult. Bison's in this case is this, which is a really slow move, honestly. It's like 10 frames. In fact, it is slow that if you're not really prepared, you can get into situations where it just doesn't even work because Ryu has gotten too close and hit a button too early. So in addition to working on the range, making sure that you know when to hit the button and not, getting clipped and then Ryu jumping right afterwards, because this is totally a thing. If Ryu jumps after a Hadouken that hits you, you can't necessarily do a lot, especially if you weren't expecting it to hit you. But there, as you see, it trades. Even though technically I whiffed entirely, so I didn't have anything to worry about. And it recovers slowly enough that you can't just hit it all the time. Fortunately, it's long enough that you can get away with a bunch of things. But let's say that for some reason you don't want to hit that button. You don't trust it, you don't want to get hurt. You need something faster. Faster than 10 frames at least. You don't want to hit jab for whatever reason. Maybe it's because it does too little damage and doesn't reset your situation, for example. Bison is not a character where hitting stand jab is one of your best options. because I'm fairly sure that crouch jab does not work in that scenario. And to stand jab means you have to give up down back charge in case you needed that for something. You have options of things like Inferno, but those are not really good either, as you can see. Even the EX one won't really help you out. This is a good way to figure out which moves you can get away with after hitting the long poke button. Because regardless of whether or not you actually hit the button, you probably spent that much time deciding whether or not it was a good idea to hit any button. So my goal here is to not do any of that, to hit something faster. And because people know Bison's anti-airs aren't that great, and they know that they can trade with them, they're more likely to hit a button on jump in, most people anyway. But Bison does have a solution to that. And it isn't just dashing either. If you're in V trigger, dashing is probably one of the best solutions, but he has another solution. One that actually helps him a lot more than most things. That. The reason why this is most useful is because now you have a fireball. And depending on where you are in this matchup, that can be a big deal. And your opponent, knowing that you're likely to do that at least a little bit, is probably more willing to do other things when they're trying to come in on you. You have a lot of options here. But what if you have the fireball already, can't use it, and want to keep it, but you still don't feel comfortable going for the anti-air? That's where the dash comes from. That is what the dash is for. You can feel that, oh, your opponent is probably not going to attack anyway, or they're going to attack precisely because they realize you can't actually absorb it again, and are going for the whole setup of throw loop or something similar to that. You could be low on life and you don't want to get thrown. Bison is incredibly good at getting out of the way of stuff like that. He's just not there. This has a lot more to do with the distance of his dash than the speed of it. And in fact, it can even be partially confirmed. You can hit the forward once, and I'm pretty sure forward back forward works. But you have to do that super fast, and I think you can only do it on stick. The good part is that this always works in that spacing. So you can check whether or not your character has a good enough forward dash, or one that makes their hitbox change or move itself or something, such that you can just calmly block a Hadouken, hit medium kick, and then dash out of the problem. There are other things that Bison can use that dash to get out of, but those aren't the really important things here. The important thing here is holding on to stuff you actually want in the case where your character has a lot of complex tools that you need to build up stores and stuff for, but don't necessarily have time to build them naturally. Jury, for example, benefits from dashing away because most attacks that can follow on from that she can actually beat with Fuharin, or if she feels like use meter because her opponent thinks she's going to, pinwheel, a bunch of other stuff. Now, if you can just medium pinwheel, you can probably deal with it, but because of the way the invincibility on her ES pinwheel works, you might not even get away with that well. So you have to be very careful about it. It's that sort of thing, that sort of tiny tweak for a particular character to solve the problem. That's very important here. And that's why we created the Kata, to make sure that you have the option of learning a bunch of stuff about how your character interacts with people in this scenario, because it's not just Ryu's Hadouken. While that is the obvious example here, because we know for a fact that Ryu is -6, and even though you can't hit him, he can space himself. That's the general idea. The general idea is to know that your opponent is minus enough, usually 5, 6, sometimes 4 depending on the distance, that you can hit a long range button and they have to block. But if you misspace it, they could jump. And that's a quick way to get yourself killed in this game. A lot of us have the tendency, for example, to hit sweep in those situations because sweep is our longest range button. But when you hit sweep and your opponent happens to jump, you're basically going to die. And if they're too close, you're going to die because you hit sweep. So you need a safe button to hit. The point of the Kata is to get you used to everything that is associated with hitting that safe button so you can get somewhere. It just also happens to throw in a bunch of attention, stress, and high-low blocking. Depending on how you put in the input, that is. So your aims are to recognize when you should hit nothing and wait for a jump in or block more. To recognize when you should hit something. And to deal with a situation when you thought one of those things was true and you were wrong. As best you can, because there is always a spacing where that just will result in you getting clipped, punished, hurt, or something else coming up in those general ways. It also trains you to hit certain things on Hadouken block stun, which is important. Not as useful when it comes to other moves. The block stun is different, you have to learn them all separately, but the idea stays. As you can see, it's actually that button is so slow that you can end up messing yourself up. Because if you weren't ready enough for whatever reason, you weren't sure he was going to jump, you didn't want to throw out a slow button thinking he was going to jump. By the time you're ready for the jump, unless you were telling yourself from the very beginning he was going to, you might get nothing. Of course, again, Bison has better anti-airs for the situation, but not a lot of them that deal with his down back charge. And maybe you needed to keep that. Maybe your opponent can make you lose charge just by throwing Hadoukens at you. That would be terrible. Because at least in the case of the dash situation, you haven't opened yourself up. You've just lost the charge and probably stayed at exactly the same neutral situation and can get something off that. So, with the full focus, your aim is to hit that and get out of the way. Recognize when you should hit it anyway, and deal with every single instance in which you have misjudged it until you no longer misjudge it at all. While all the while being confused by someone constantly switching sides on you and therefore making you deal with something equivalent to a left-right mix-up even though it isn't really. You can even learn over time to delay your button when he's far out so that you hit the button that he is trying to hit yours with, like that. There are a bunch of things this works on, and a couple of other things it doesn't. Ryu's super Hadouken ability allows him to throw another EX Hadouken right afterwards and cause you grief. And axe kick is generally better because of the way that interacts with other things as well. But there's your point. Get out of the way. depending on the character, this is great. For others, it might be terrible. We can wait for the day that they allow Bison to cancel out of dash into Psycho Crusher. I called it for Season 3. If you have a character that has a specifically really good air-to-air or anti-air situation that you want to set up, the other purpose of the Kata is helping you understand what happens when you get pushed out and he neither jumps nor anything else. And the final way to set that up is easy. But it stops the jump from being ambiguous. You will always know that he's going to jump after 5. All you have to do is return the action 2 to the same one that was used for the Ryu bot itself, which means that he will either do action 2, then pause and do another full action 2, because he got back to down bat, or he will throw the Hadouken for 5. This is to teach you different ranges that you can do stuff at, and it's useful to know, but not super useful. This will of course also be included, just in case you want to learn it. And of course, as you see there, once you do have that charge, you worry about this whole thing way less. The final note for Bison players specifically is that you have to hit that button fairly early, but it's very active. So I wouldn't worry about it. The aim is actually to learn how early you have to hit it. While the bot will not often hit you for doing so, that move has a lot of active, and if you hit it fairly early, it's easier to recover before he can hit you on the ground just by dropping in. Especially if the person is more likely to jump with something other than a light. But as you can see, technically, I didn't really hold that. I got counter hit anyway because somehow the parry keeps the counter hit property even after I've absorbed something. We can also ask them to like deal with that, but we'll see what happens. As with all our katas and similar, you will see a difference later. If there's anything that changes in it due to the release of Arcade Edition, or looks like it will be changed if we happen to get information from PS Experience, we'll be making updates and possibly making notes. But yes, generally don't worry too much about people who do this with lights, because they are in fact able to usually get through you. But zoners don't do this as often, and you can shift some of the stuff around so that you get to see it, but it's harder to do. It is possible to change what button Ryu hits at the beginning of Action 1 in order to get more data like that, but we don't suggest it for the beginning because this sort of thing will make you focus on the ground game better. But as you can see there, slower buttons don't necessarily get through the parry as easily, so you don't have to worry as much. Lighter buttons get hit later so they don't come into contact as quick, all those sorts of things. It's very dependent on the character, but once you understand it from the Ryu level, it becomes an understanding of frame data rather than an understanding of characters as a whole in general. You have a fairly good idea of what Akuma can do just by knowing Ryu's frame data, how you respond to Ryu stuff, and what happens after that, and how you should therefore tweak the numbers to respond to Akuma. Muscle memory is a different matter, but fortunately most shotos can actually be input as this exact thing without it changing too much. Ken and Akuma are just more likely to move around less with their tatsus, which can be a problem, but overall the idea stays. So with that, I hope this has been useful to you, whether you're watching it on the stream or referenced later on in order to help you understand what was aimed at. This is Berillion42_MK. This bot will be released at this kata, I should say, will be released at our website 2-mk.org. And since this is the second one, we will be putting up the katas page, so you can go to 2-mk.org/katas to get this and the kata 21, which comes from Ken. This should be available around 6 Eastern on Sunday. Until then, of course, be sure to win your ranked matches to get your extra fight money. You know, in case they like reveal Sagat at Rebel Battlegrounds or something. So enjoy watching that. And next week we'll be probably beginning to look at yet another kata, which doesn't even involve a bot, but specifically the sort of mindset required won't change. But stay tuned for that and stick around throughout next week. We are now streaming on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday until AE is out, or until we are absolutely sure that something specific will change, and therefore that our bots will need to be re-evaluated. Good night, everyone.